It is more than dumb to suggest that a writer delighted in or depended on words. But that was James Thurber in a nutshell. Words were not merely the atoms of his stories, they were frequently the point of his stories. He chased and analyzed words as might a detective. Such is figuratively the case in today's tale of homonyms gone wild. From 1953's Thurber country, I bring you The Casebook of James Thurber by James Thurber. The case of the Gloucester sympathizer was an easy one to crack, once I had sense enough to stop trying to crack it the hard way. I first heard about the sympathizer one day last summer from a friend of mine in Annisquam, Massachusetts, near Gloucester. He told me he had called the Gloucester telephone company one day to complain about something, and the operator had said, "One moment, please. I'll connect you with the sympathizer." She must have said supervisor, I said. This annoyed him, since he is proud of his ear and accuracy. "Not at all," he snapped. "I said, connect me with whom?" And she repeated, "With the sympathizer." I wanted to know what the sympathizer was like when he was finally connected with her. Did she begin by saying, "Heavens to Betsy, isn't that too bad? I'm dreadfully sorry." He looked disappointed. She was courteous, crisp, and competent, he said. I reached for my hypodermic needle. Was she terribly solicitous, I demanded. He frowned. "No," he said, "she wasn't." When I got back to my home in Cornwall, Connecticut, I picked up the phone and asked the Cornwall telephone operator to connect me with the sympathizer. "You're a caution, Mr. Thurber," she said, laughed, and hung up. Then I called the long-distance operator in Torrington, 15 miles away. She said there wasn't any sympathizer or sympathizer in Torrington, but she was sorry it had happened, whatever it was. I could tell that she thought I was a caution, too. I was about to try Hartford to see if there was a sympathizer there when it occurred to me to write the Gloucester Telephone Company and ask them about their sympathizer. I got a prompt and cordial letter from the company announcing that there wasn't any sympathizer and offering its consolation and best wishes. I got my violin out of its case and began sawing moodily in the general direction of Chloe, lost in meditation. Naturally, I deduced at last, no reputable firm or corporation would employ a sympathizer because the very existence of such a person would lend a note of gloom and insecurity to merchandising and other business transactions. I telephoned my friend and gave him the results of my findings in one sentence. "There isn't any sympathizer," I told him. "Yes, there is," he snarled. "Go to hell," I said, and hung up. The case of the Gloucester sympathizer was similar to the case of the young woman named Sherlock Holmes, a problem I solved the easy way a couple of years ago. George Spencer had told me that a guy he knew named Harry Huff was going to marry a girl named Sherlock Holmes. I said this was nonsense because there isn't any girl named Sherlock Holmes. He said I didn't know anything about it. I said it was dangerous to believe everything one heard and to go around repeating it. He snapped the leash back on his dog's collar, picked up its throwing stick, and went away. I got out the phone book. There were 2 Henry Huffs listed, and I called the first one. "Nah," he said, "I'm living in sin with Dr. Watson. I thought everybody knew that." He was obviously the wrong Henry Huff, so I hung up on him. The second one turned out to be the right one. I asked him to spell out the name of his fiancée. Without hesitation, he said he didn't want to. So I mentioned George Spencer and what he'd said about Sherlock Holmes. Huff was annoyed, but he finally told me the name of the girl he was going to marry, one Shirley Combs. It reminded me of the curious adventure of the oral surgeon's mouse, which had taken place 30 years ago when I was a reporter. The city editor answered the phone one day and sent for me. "The oral surgeons in convention here are about to operate on a mouse," he said. "Slide over and watch it." I went away and came right back. "What's the matter?" snarled the editor. "Wouldn't the mouse open wide?" "It wasn't a mouse," I snarled back. "It was a mouth. It was a guy's mouth." This is a great blow to the editor, almost as great as that which befell the little boy in Pennsylvania Station, who thought the announcer was announcing the make-believe train, only to find out it was just the old Maple Leaf Express on its routine way again. The anatomy of confusion is a large subject, and I have no intention of writing the standard treatise on it, but I offer to whoever does the most singular of all of my cases, the case of the cockeyed Spaniard. This remarkable piece of confusion took place in Columbus, Ohio, as long ago as 1922. I lived next door to a young couple named Dan and Janet Henderson at the time. Dan was a well-known reveler of the neighborhood, given to odd companions and peculiar pranks. One afternoon about 6 o'clock, Janet phoned me and asked me to come over. Her voice sounded wavy and troubled. "What's Dan up to now?" I asked. She sighed. "He's bringing home a cockeyed Spaniard," she said, "and I simply won't face them both alone." I slipped my brass knuckles into my pocket and went over to the Henderson house. "The only Spaniards I know of in Columbus," I told Janet, "are a dozen students at Ohio State, but I doubt that they would be as cockeyed as early as 6 o'clock. It transpired that Dan Henderson had phoned his ominous message while Mrs. Henderson was in the bathtub. Their maid, Mary, had answered the phone. I interviewed Mary in the kitchen. She was pop-eyed and nervous. The physical stature of the Spaniard and the degree of his intoxication had obviously become magnified in her mind. "I'm not going to mess around with no cockeyed Spaniard," she told me flatly. "If he mislests me, I'll hit him with a bottle." While we waited for Dan and his friend to show up, I began to apply my special methods to the case, and before long I had figured it out. No doubt you have too, since you are probably smarter than I was in 1922. When Dan came home to his frantic wife, he was carrying the cockeyed Spaniard in his arms, but the fellow was, of course, neither cockeyed nor Spanish. He was sad-eyed, 4 months old, sleepy, hungry, and definitely sober, as cute a cocker spaniel as you would ever want to see. Mary stubbornly clung to the name she had got over the phone, and her insistence on this pleasant distortion became generally known about the town. People would call up the Henderson house and ask for her and say, "This is the Canine Census Bureau. What kind of dog do you have in your home?" Mary would always reply promptly and brightly, "He's a cockeyed Spaniard." I often wonder whatever became of her. I hope she is well and happy. The Casebook of James Thurber by James Thurber. See you on Current on June 20th.